Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we're back from another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, oh no, Sharia law has come to NYC, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Persecution Fetish subreddit. And that looks like an X post from the Golden Age Times, who tweeted, tomorrow, Zoran Mamdani to be the first NYC mayor sworn in on a Koran, which belongs to his grandfather, per New York Post. Rib NYC, you had a good run. Heartbreak emoji. And then they have a picture of the Statue of Liberty in a burqa, it looks like, next to a picture of Zoran Mamdani. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Zoran Mamdani. But with that being said, I don't personally think he's very much the Sharia law type of Muslim. He's more of the woke communist type of Muslim. And, I personally don't care for either of those. But, ultimately, if you want to say he's whatever you want to think he is, I think you should be able to. I personally don't think he's good, but I think you should try and attack him on what he actually is rather than what you think he is. But believe whatever anyone he is, whatever you want to. I'm not the one to dictate what you believe about anyone. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Bernie Sanders and Ron DeSantis speak out against data center boom. It's a bad sign for AI industry from CNBC.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if people want to open up data centers, they should be able to. Ultimately, I think it determines if it's their property or not. If they're on their own private property, they should be able to do it. You do whatever you want in your own property. And yeah, I personally might not care if a data center was built right next to my house and it was being loud all night. But sometimes, people are going to do stuff that you don't like, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have why Minnesota child care fraud is MAGA's new obsession from MS Now, formerly MSNBC, and that's a post from Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the fraud, but I definitely do think a lot of right-wing people are so obsessed with it because it's the Somalian immigrant community that's doing most of it. But regardless, Reddit, that they usually just go for things that uphold their narratives as well. No one will call them out for it. So, ultimately, people are always going to go with whatever makes them comfortable and upholds their narratives and agendas. And that's what the Minnesota child care fraud is for MAGA, I would say. But, a lot of Reddit, it's just a woke circle jerk, and they would never call themselves out on it. So, ultimately, believe whatever you want to believe. But ultimately, trying to don't go after the always reliable targets. I would say, just try and challenge your belief set sometimes. Don't just say, don't just go with whatever the current thing is. A lot of people just go whatever the current thing is. That's more associated with a lot of people on the left, like with the COVID vaccine, Ukraine, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of people on the right do that too. I remember back in the summer they were all over Irina Zarutska and then Charlie Kirk, and then now the Minnesota child care fraud. You can't always do whatever the current thing is. Ultimately, I don't really think Irina Zarutska or Charlie Kirk should have been murdered senselessly. But ultimately, that people are always just going to talk about whatever the current thing is, and I think that's true as true for the right as it is for the left, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Dr. Peter McCullough's great speech about Big Pharma's lies and censorship on treatments that work and save lives, posted by YSHCRP, and that's cross-post from the Medicinal GHB Info subreddit. And yeah, Dr. Peter McCullough can be kind of a kook, but he's definitely right that Big Pharma is bad. A lot of writers agreed that Big Pharma was bad, but then they wanted vaccine mandates, and it just goes to show people will go with whatever the narrative is. Reddit hated Big Pharma, but then the narrative was that Big Pharma is good, vaccines are good, and therefore we need vaccine mandates. So ultimately, if you want to follow that narrative, I think you should be able to. But it's always important to question the narrative. Reddit, it's interesting. Reddit hates big business, but somehow they'll always find a way to justify whatever Big Pharma is shilling, and that just goes to show, these people don't have any principles. They'll only follow whatever the official narrative, DNC narrative, and agenda is. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Israeli tech billionaire says it's time to limit the First Amendment, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit, and that looks like, I guess, an Israeli billionaire saying that on CNBC. And yeah, personally, I don't think we should limit the First Amendment, but Reddit has been saying we gotta limit the First Amendment because of hate speech, misinformation for years now. But when an Israeli billionaire says, "Oh, we gotta limit the First Amendment because of anti-Semitism," Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. It just goes to show you, these people have no values, only whatever the current narrative is. They've censored me from this subreddit for over a year now, coming up on 2 years, and they don't see any hypocrisy in that. When you're railing for free speech, you gotta support free speech. You just can't censor those you disagree with. But this subreddit, it's full of hypocrites who don't have any consistent beliefs other than what the official DNC narrative is, pretty much. And the only complaint that you're allowed to make against whatever the official DNC narrative is that they're not progressive enough. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Mar-a-Lago was key to Jeffrey Epstein's criminal enterprise from thenation.com, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but I don't think Mar-a-Lago's or Epstein's gonna bring down Trump as they've been over in the past. Eventually people will move over to the next, whatever the next thing is. It looks like that's gonna be Venezuela currently. And yeah, eventually people are just, that's very much how the news cycle works. People are always on the current thing, as I was talking about earlier. It's always whatever the current thing is. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have cops forced to explain why AI-generated police report claimed officer transformed into frog from Futurism.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added the body cam software and the AI report writing software picked up on the movie that was playing in the background, which happened to be The Princess and the Frog. Police Sergeant Rick Keel told the broadcast, referring to Disney's 2009 musical comedy. That's when we learned the importance of correcting these AI-generated reports. And yeah, it just goes to show you that, since humans are fallible, AI is naturally going to be fallible, and I think that's important to remember as well. Next we have, is this a subreddit for libertarians who didn't drink the boomer Gen X idiot juice, posted by Impassionata, and they added, I don't know if I ever took libertarians all that seriously. Ron Paul was never inspiring to me, but I was surprised to see how many libertarians developed paralyzing confusion in the wake of MAGA's obvious lawless fascism, and how many developed bootlicking woke derangement syndrome as some sort of weird coping mechanism. And I guess I would kind of agree with that. Ultimately, I think there are bad people in all the generations when it comes to libertarian perspective. But regardless, I don't think MAG is libertarian, but I don't think woke is libertarian either. And I think it's important to call them both out as much as possible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have U.S. carrying out strikes in Venezuela, U.S. official says, from Reuters.com, posted by Mama Didn't Raise No Bitsy, and they added, our FIFA Peace Prize award-winning president is launching military operations in Venezuela. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. I've always been against U.S. regime change, but it reminds me of a post I did to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit recently. I'll share that now. I said, so the U.S. government has done another regime change. I'd be shocked and angry, but after Syria, Libya, Ukraine, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, Somalia, Grenada, etc., it's important to remember the old adage, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. At this point, the most surprising thing is that people are still surprised. Thoughts? And I added, politics is pretty much all just theater. It wouldn't have been different under Kamala. If you think otherwise, you were Charlie Brown thinking Lucy's really going to let him kick the football this time. People are saying, this wouldn't have happened under Kamala, or Kamala would have had it's this congressionally authorized. And, it doesn't really matter, The president's pretty much just a figurehead to distract from the fact that the deep state and the military-industrial complex is the ones who are really running this country. And that's what's more to remember, The generals are really the ones who decide stuff like this, not Trump. Trump might say it was his idea, but ultimately, I don't think he's the one really making decisions. Just like I don't think Joe Biden was the one making decisions or Obama was the one making decisions. The president is a figurehead first and foremost. I think that's very important to note from a libertarian perspective. Next, we have Fox and Friends asked President Trump about Rep. Jim McGovern, saying his Venezuela strike was unjustified and lacked congressional approval, and he replied, "These are weak, stupid people." And that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And Trump's always going to say things to get people riled up. It's like eventually you gotta stop taking his bait every single time. It's like, he's putting his name on the Kennedy Center. He's literally Hitler. And that just goes to show you, if you want to fall for all of Trump's megalomaniacal WWE heel shit. I think you should be able to, but I think you should stop giving the guy so much attention every single time he tries to bait you. When you take the bait 1,000 times, it's like, as I said earlier, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 1,000 times, maybe you deserve to get fooled. And that's very much what you see with progressive writers and Trump. They'll take his bait every single time when he says something outrageous or does something outrageous, and eventually you got to stop giving him so much attention. If you stop giving him attention, it's like that one episode of Simpsons where all the advertising signs come to life and start destroying the town. When the town stops giving them attention, they all wither up and die, and that's very much what happened to Trump. But Trump, he's just a master at keeping the public's attention. And the writers will say, "Oh, he's the president of the United States." I'm like, there's no law that you have to pay attention to what the president of the United States does. That's that's the law Trump would probably pass if he felt like it. But ultimately, I think the presidency is pretty much just a soap opera at this point. And as I said earlier, he's not the one really running the show. Next, we have CBS folds under DOJ pressure, kills 60 Minutes bombshell on Epstein files, cover up amid Transparency Act violation from nationwire.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-posted from the No Filter News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I've been over in the past, I don't really care for CBS or any legacy media as a whole. But with that being said, I personally would have liked to maybe seen that segment. But regardless, 60 Minutes is mostly just DNC propaganda. The Epstein files would probably it's all going to be Trump bad instead of going after anyone else in the Epstein files. I do think it's important that Trump's in the Epstein files, as I've noted in the past. But regardless, we gotta care about the other people in the Epstein files as well, and that's not what the 60 Minutes story is doing. The 60 Minutes story is setting an agenda that's really just Trump in the Epstein files, and that's why I don't really care for it. At this point, I think you just gotta let broadcast television become irrelevant. Let independent media like this show start to thrive, and let the broadcast media fall into the dustbin of history, I would say. Next, we have the Putinization of U.S. foreign policy has arrived in Venezuela, and confirms yes, we are the bad guys from TheGuardian.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, I think it's interesting. Russia condemned the act, yet, they're still trying to link Trump to Russia, and it just goes to show, in some aspects, I wish later that the catcher wasn't Maduro but Putin, because if they captured Putin, all the blue pills would still have to bend over backwards to justify that Trump's a Russian asset, because it's been that programmed into them at this point. And yeah, I personally don't really care for the Trump's the Russian asset argument. I do think, Russia might have some sway over him, but I definitely do think there's tons of other groups that have more sway over him, like the deep state, the military-industrial complex in Israel, and Reddit really doesn't care about those groups as much. They do kind of care about Israel to their credit, but not nearly as much as the Russia they constantly say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Organize on the Job, Yes But How from libcom.org, posted by GoreMPerson777. And yeah, personally, I think, as I've been over in the past, if workers want to organize, I think they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to organize if they don't want to. Ultimately, that's very much the libertarian position. We need voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. Next, we have, we're going to run the country. Trump says U.S. will govern Venezuela until there's a proper transition from NBCNews.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately the U.S. government can justify doing whatever it feels like, and since they have unlawful legal use of force, oftentimes you don't have the ability to stop them. Next, we have Trump says U.S. will run Venezuela, won't rule out the U.S. boots on the ground, from WashingtonPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, we'll run it properly, we'll run it professionally, we'll have the greatest oil companies in the world going and invest billions, oil companies, ... And yeah, personally, this could be Trump's mission accomplished moment where, they came into Iraq and then Bush was on the ship saying mission accomplished and everyone was celebrating, but then they were in Iraq forever. I do think, at the very least, Trump should be smart enough to realize that Iraq was very damaging for the Republican Party in the long term, and it could be Venezuela as well if they put having long-term boots on the ground. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, I did a master place on Trump's speech changing certain words, so it sounds like Bush talking about Iraq. Is it really that different? posted by Nietzsche, and they added, seriously, how is this different? Aside from more modern circumstances, e.g. killing people on boats, does the justification for today really read any different than if Bush gave the speech about Iraq back in 2004? The only difference between invading Iraq and now invading Venezuela that I can see is back in 2004, Bush hadn't recently pardoned a violent dictator who was tried and found guilty in federal court for the crimes Bush accused Saddam of. And I would agree with that. This is pretty much just Iraq 2.0, but it happens under Democrat presidents as well. Like, look at Syria. They had the U.S. had back regime change that was successful finally after like over a decade in December 2024, or Ukraine, where the U.S. asked for a coup in 2014 to replace the old pro-Russian government with the more current pro-Western government. And it just goes to show this is going to happen in pretty much regardless of which branch of the Uniparty is in power. Next, we have So Stoked for the sequel to Team America World Police, posted by not Your Granny's grandkid, and that's the SpongeBob meme from that one episode where they're raising the clam, and it's Patrick saying, it's just a bit of nation building, it's not imperialism, and besides, Venezuela will be better off in the end. And then SpongeBob shows Hawaii 1893, Haiti 1910, Nicaragua 1912, most of Guatemala's history, Dominican Republic 1961, 1965, and then he points outside Afghanistan. And yeah, it just goes to show this is the U.S. has been doing this pretty much since the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in the 1890s. It's not going to stop anytime soon. Everyone's voters are constantly like, we don't want the U.S. to be the world police anymore, but the U.S. always has to be the world police, pretty much, it seems. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump signals more Latin American invasions could be next after capturing Maduro from Axios.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. As I said, ultimately the U.S. is always going to be the world police and constantly justify foreign interventionism. But, it doesn't really matter which branch of the Uniparty is in power. Next we have, so when are we going to talk about Tulsi Gabbard, posted by Caldwell Curmudgeon, and they added, as many of you know, she ran for the Democratic Party nomination in 2020, primarily ending regime change wars, a largely libertarian position. She's currently the director of national intelligence, making her a cabinet member of the current administration that just conducted the head of state of our nation. Why is no one, especially from Democrats, calling for resignation? Edit context. And, it just goes to say, Tulsi is a perfect example of a sellout. She'll say one thing, but then take power and do the opposite. It's a lot of the same flaw of a lot of the presidents, like Trump or Obama. They'll campaign on change and shaking things up, but they'll do the same old when they actually take power. Next, we have Common Sense, posted by GrandPerson777. And they added, and it's a meme, syndicalism isn't independently a struggle, it's simply common sense for workers to unite against management and act to increase their influence. And yeah, if workers want to do that, I think they should be able to, but with that being said, maybe management won't be happy with that, and they'll fire them as a result, and that since it's a private company, they can do whatever they want to. And, sometimes, I don't think that's too ethical, but ultimately people are going to justify whatever they want to. If they want to justify forming labor unions, I think they should be able to. But, if people want to have problems with that, I think they should be able to as well, because labor unions, they might sound like a good idea, but, they're often corrupt and as exploitative of workers as the management they're rallying against is. Just look at how much the union heads get paid compared to the union rank and file member. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have 2019 Russia's quid pro quo offer on Venezuela for Ukraine, post from archives.yaleglobal.yale.edu, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, Fiona Hill, Trump's former top Russia advisor, testified during Trump's first impeachment hearing that Trump and Putin were making an arrangement about Ukraine and Venezuela, and the Russians and the security juncture were signaling very strongly that they wanted to somehow make some very strange swap agreement between Venezuela and Ukraine. Your Monroe Doctrine, you want us out of your backyard, we have your own version of this, you want us out and you're in our backyard in Ukraine. Soundland in charge of Ukraine. It was very unusual because we were given no instructions. There wasn't a directive. Ambassador Bolton didn't know about this. No State Department seems to know about this either. And yeah, of course, people like Ninja Lover here, as I went into earlier, they're too programmed to think on the Trump is Russian asset mindset to ever question it. Russia condemned the capture of Maduro, but that goes against their narrative, so they're not going to say it. And, that's my thoughts on that issue. This was really just a flex against China and Russia as a whole, and showing that the U.S. is still pretty much the dominant force in the world. But Reddit still somehow has to find its way to be pro-Russia, even if Russia openly says we were against this. Next, we have introduce me to your favorite libertarian politician. Aside from Ron Paul, Rand Paul, and Thomas Massie, I want to learn about someone new. Posted by OK Grapefruit 218. And they said, and yeah, I understand Rand Paul defines himself as libertarian-ish, but disagrees with some few points. But overall, these people are widely regarded as libertarian. I'm looking for more people that libertarians actually like. I got sense that libertarians really didn't like Jerry Johnson, even though he was the presidential nominee in 2016. I never heard much from Will in 2020. I knew barely anything about Joe Jorgensen. I feel like most libertarians universally hated Chase Oliver. It makes me wonder who has support. Also, don't have to be someone in a major position. If there's a libertarian running for comptroller you really like, tell me about them. I'd love to hear about someone new. And yeah, libertarians, they can always be kind of a feisty bunch when it comes to their politicians, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is like whatever politicians you want to. Some politicians I would say are more libertarian than others, but ultimately I would say that any politician is really just an apparatus of the state, and therefore kind of automatically more authoritarian than libertarian. I think the libertarian position is if you ever do get a political position of power, you should try and work to shrink the state as much as possible, and also maybe try and dismantle it as much as possible, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're gonna see if there's anything new. Looks like there's nothing new, so we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.